Thank you, and also congratulations to the Foundation on its 10th anniversary. It's an honor to be here. My topic is to talk about intellectual capital, a subject which, as you can tell, if you think about it for a long time, makes your hair fall out. Chris, I'm glad, introduced me as being the author of one of my books. I'm also the founder of a center called the Center for the Study of the Public Domain, and in a textual introduction at one of my more recent speeches, I was identified as the leading expert on the contributions of the pubic domain to innovation and culture. Truly, those are legion, but I think it was not I who unlocked them, and I just want to...
But congratulations.
My pleasure. I think it was the Freud guy probably got there first. Intellectual capital, in theory, arguing about definitions is generally pointless, is all of the value in the world that isn't the physical stuff. Talking about all of that is even more impossible than the tasks, I think, set for some of the previous speakers, because what we're talking about is stuff that is both intangible and where the most important material is the stuff that hasn't been invented yet. So it's a particularly difficult task. What I've done instead is to talk about or to focus on three areas. Each of them offers the same story. There are promises, there are things that are good, and there are also inefficiencies, mistakes, and in some cases, disasters. The three areas are three areas that I think could transform the world of intellectual capital over our time horizon, and intellectual capital contributing to the kind of broader visions of prosperity that we're discussing here. The first area is state-generated data, and the second area is making the web work for science, the possibility of actually transforming our development of science and technology. And the third is the global intellectual property regime, and I'm going to say a few words about each. State-generated data is a vitally important and much neglected component of the innovation world globally. Let me just give, what do I mean by state-generated data? This is everything from weather data, GPS data, traffic information, geospatial location, GPS, think of that, to the human genome. Drafted and released by states collectively as well as by a private entity. How important is this economically, and what kind of contribution to innovation are we talking about? Let's just pick weather data. Europe, with the most recent figures I had, spent $9.5 billion on gathering, generating weather data. It got back out of that, in terms of the economic yield, $68 billion. That's a nine-fold multiplier, which is pretty darn good. 39-fold multiplier, which is pretty darn good. What do I mean by got back? This is everything from private industry that is generated using that data to decisions which are made better because we know about data. Am I going to have a construction crew that digs when I know the snow is going to come? Are you going to go on vacation when it's just going to go and rain? Yeah, if you're from Britain, the answer is yes. So this yields an incredible return. Think of the returns we talked about when we're talking about stimulus. People will go, oh, maybe we could get 1.5, right? And everyone's getting very excited about that. This is 39-fold. That's Europe. The US spends $19 billion on weather data, about twice as much, and it gets back $750 billion. That's an astounding multiplier, enormous multiplier. Why? In the case of the US, it's because the US releases all publicly generated data at the cost of reproduction. If you want the entire weather history of the United States to date, you can get it for the cost of a box of DVDs. Right? Europe, in general, many qualifications, tries to make publicly generated data pay for itself. So there are fees. The idea is let's recover the cost of generation. Those are two different techniques. Either could work, economically speaking. Empirically, it turns out that the US approach works better. Basically, we release this commons of information. Lots of entrepreneurs add value on top of it, add their own secret sauce, create the Weather Channel, what have you, and the result is many, many, many fold. My point here is we could do this much better and much more. There's an enormous inefficiency here. Some of the inefficiency can be cured by private entrepreneurs. That's the way you make businesses. Some by public policy entrepreneurs. That's how you get change. A huge area. And by the way, I'm not just talking money. I'm not talking GDP. I'm talking what my friend Hal Abelson calls the FDB index, which is the fewer dead babies index. This is something which affects every component on our list of prosperity. One very brief example, the monsoon kills hundreds of people every year all over Southeast Asia. A group of researchers wanted to do a predictive map so they could find when the monsoon's going to strike, where it's going to strike, how severe it's going to be, how severe the flooding is going to be. They try and model the entire world's weather data. They get the US's total records of weather data for a cost of $2,000, a box of DVDs. They then go to Europe and they find that a single German province wants to charge them €1.5 million. So they used only the US data. Result, less accurate prediction. Result, dead people. So I really want to stress this. This is important on every component. Second, making the web work for science. The web works great for buying books. Works great for buying shoes. Works great for flirting. Works great for porn, or so I hear. The World Wide Web was invented to make science work better. Not so good there. Yes, we have lots more access than we used to have, and that's wonderful. I used to be on the board of the Public Library of Science. PLOS ONE, now the largest science journal in the world, published 6,000 articles in 2009. Last year, it published 29,000 articles, right? This is an incredible explosion of access, and I want to undermine that explosion. But on the other hand, much of this content, not all of it, but much of it goes into privately controlled silos where we can't do all the things that we assume we do on the rest of the social web. If you go and you read about some book on Tyler Cowen's blog, you expect to be able to click to an Amazon page, see a bunch of reviews, cross-link it, what's the author like, all of that stuff happens automatically, right? If you try and do that with a science article, you can find the word that occurs there, if you know the right word to cite. Can you text mine it? That's a violation of copyright law, probably a violation of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, certainly a violation of the contract you signed with Reed Elsevier. Can you link that data in there? Can you do semantic web, text mining? You can't do that. The world of the web working for science would be the world that when I read your article, I can click to get the full data set on which you base that article immediately to replicate your results or not. I can also associate it with all of the other articles dealing with the same thing, whether or not they're in the field that I know. Take inflammation, very important to rheumatology, very important to cancer. I'm a rheumatologist. I don't know from cancer. Right now, we are optimizing the web for the Mark I eyeball, but our methods of generation, that's analog, our methods of generation have gone digital. Masses more data, very poor search and retrieval techniques. It's not that scientists need more data. They're swimming in data. It's that they need better methods of managing it. Huge benefits could redound to this. I cannot be too much of an enthusiast here. There are 1.4 billion connected people. A lot of them are smarter than you, and at least one of them has a better idea about what to do with your data than you do. Exposing the world of science to the web not only has profound distributional issues in terms of the developing world. It's easy for me at Duke. I can get access to any journal I want. It's not so easy if I'm in a university in the developing world. Third issue, and I'll spend the balance of my time here. Global intellectual property. So intellectual property regime is intellectual property regimes are very important. People generally focus on intellectual property regimes as merely about the provision of incentives, which they are. You all know the story. Lots of innovation is a public good, non-rival, non-excludable. If, and it's a huge if, there aren't ways of capturing value from that innovation without excluding people from it, and there may well be lots of ways of doing that, right? But if there aren't, maybe what we need to do is to create a temporary state-created monopoly, a copyright, a patent, and allow you to require people to pay for access. That's the classic model. What people miss, and I'm not going to go into this here, there are lots of other functions that are equally important. One of them is that by forming a market where previously there was no market, They allow the information processing mechanisms of markets to work. Markets are our information processing mechanisms. That's what Adam Smith was one of the first cyberneticists, right? He understood that markets take lots and lots of inputs and actually provide measures of value out of that because they aggregate them and give us measures. If more people are buying boy bands or Viagra, that's sending messages to innovators about what stuff to innovate in the future. It's a feedback loop, not just in incentives, but in the provision of information. Here's the secret of intellectual property. It's all about balancing inputs and outputs. If you want to get innovation, you need inputs, gene sequences, information, the basic chords of the musical scale, the sonnet form, right? You need stuff out of which you can assemble your innovation. But you also may want to put a property right on the output of that innovation. Set the property right too low, and the drug never gets developed. The blockbuster movie doesn't get made. That's at least what IP has always assumed. Set the property right level too high, and you stop the next innovator by raising the cost of his or her inputs, right? So if you can take one thing away from what I say, you will hear most policymakers around the world saying, we need to raise intellectual property levels. This is like saying, we need to water plants more, right? Infinitely, right? No. Too much water is as bad as too little. Too many intellectual property rights are as bad as too few. The question is how to set the balance. We are setting this balance globally now. This is a change. Since 1994, we have had effectively the World Trade Organization in the business of saying IP rights are part of the global level playing field of what counts as free trade. And therefore, we can enforce trade sanctions. To be sure, we've been harmonizing for much longer than that using national agreements, but this has much more teeth, it's much more powerful. Now, this has obvious benefits. We all know why it's nicer to have harmonious systems, why it's dangerous to have outlier countries, and so forth, and I don't want to undermine those. There's empirical evidence that shows that in certain areas, TRIPS has actually increased good things in terms of innovation, not in terms of encouraging innovation in target countries, that is to say, developing countries. That was promised and has not happened. What it has done is increased by a small but measurable amount foreign direct investment. I'm more willing to put my car company in your country if I think I have the protection of a global IP regime behind me. Fairly intuitive result. That's the good news. The bad news is pretty bad. Intellectual property regimes are profoundly local. They vary by technology. Would you create the same set of protections for software or a novel? We do, which is probably not a very good idea. The IP protection over a smartphone and the IP protection over a drug are both provided by patents. The economic effects are profoundly different. We have committed ourselves to a system which treats those things the same. That's a problem. They vary by country and stage of development. The United States, when it was founded as a pirate nation. Ben Franklin was actually sent around Europe to encourage apprentices to break their contracts with their masters and come to the United States bearing their tacit knowledge with them, both a flow of human and a flow of intellectual capital. For this, in fact, the United States policy was exactly the policy for which it now excoriates China. And the United States was the China of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th. In fact, Charles Dickens toured the United States, infuriated about the piracy of his books, and actually said there is a curious weakness of the American mind that it cannot understand the idea of intellectual property. So there have been differences over time. So, problems. We're making it globally, which denies us the ability to experiment. I was able to tell you about what was effectively a natural experiment between Europe and the US over weather data because the US did one thing and Europe did the other, and it turned out the US's method worked better, in my view, and that's what the evidence shows. We are reducing the number of experiments we're running by harmonization. That's a benefit, it's also a cost if we've harmonized around the wrong thing. We are making policy almost entirely without data. This is the biggest shock to people from outside of my area. Certainly copyright policy, and to a large extent patent policy, is set based on anecdote and intuition and very, very simple economic models. If you look at Congress's testimony in terms of should we increase the copyright term, you might expect economists talking about, return to value. You might expect, what is this, the expected value of a life plus 70 term, whatever. What you'll find is a lot of country and Western musicians testifying to Congress that the songs are like my children. Don't take my children away. This is true even in things like drug policy. I mean, it's really hard. It's as if we made drug policy by saying, so is this a good pill? Do you think we should prove it? Absolutely. I like it. And what's more, one of my friends took it and he felt better. Right? This is not the way we make drug policy or environmental policy. It is the way we make IP policy. David Cameron, British Prime Minister, asked me and 4 others to head to be the advisors to a review of the British IP system. Our number one finding, and I'm amazed that it actually made it through all the way into the report and in theory into law, is that we need to have data behind our policies, and that without data we're going to make mistakes. We are harmonizing rights internationally. Ironically, we don't harmonize exceptions. So the rights, you own this, you can control it. What about the exception? Think what Google does. Google copies the entire World Wide Web every day. In fact, many times a day. Lots of the stuff on the World Wide Web is infringing copyright. Therefore, Google copies lots of stuff that infringes. In theory, that should be illegal. Now, you're sitting there going, yeah, but that's Google. That would make Google illegal. It would make search impossible. That would destroy the World Wide Web, so that's obviously wrong. Nevertheless, that was the position of the Clinton administration as of 1994. That was the position we should have. Every company should be strictly liable for any copyright infringement it commits, even if unwilling, even if it doesn't know about it. This would have actually destroyed the web as we know it. What saves Google? An exception that says, no, we have these limited exceptions that say what you're doing isn't an infringement. All of you carry iPods. The iPod, 10,000 songs in your pocket. Average college student, of those 10,000 songs, 20 have been bought. Why isn't Apple liable for this facilitating this massive theft? Theft on an enormous scale. I mean, the preponderant use of the technology is for theft, and you know it, Apple. An exception. So, what do we do about all of this? We need to set the balance right. We need to be humble about our intuitions on IP. I argued to the board that we have a curious inability to perceive the benefits of open systems as opposed to closed systems. We need to encourage experimentation. What is the takeaway for all of this? First, I think there's space for policy entrepreneurship. It's a limited space. Sorry, Mashi, could you, excuse me. It's a limited space, but it is because of regional constraints, but it is a space nevertheless. We can experiment. I actually think there are a number of things which I could talk about more concretely, but I don't want to go over my time. The received wisdom is wrong. More rights are not necessarily better. In some cases they are, in other cases they aren't. We need to be really fine-tuned about where we go. It also opens up spaces for private entrepreneurship. The IP regime right now is supposed to create markets. In many cases, it's breaking markets. We extended copyright retrospectively, giving dead authors many, many more years of copyright. Most of those dead authors cannot be identified. That means no one can copy their books. So we took about 80% of the culture of the 20th century and said, you can't buy it, you can't copy it, you can't adapt it, and you can't do anything with it. All dead weight loss, no benefit. Out of that massive inefficiency came the Google book search plan. We'll go out and scan them anyway. Larry is going to talk about another way of dealing with one of the ambiguities in the IP system. What rights do I have in the IP world as opposed to the rights that I have in the natural world? I can lend you a book. Can I lend you a digital version of a book? Like, how does that ambiguity get resolved? There's a happy scenario here and a not so happy scenario. The happy scenario is, in each of the 3 areas I talked about, public data, the publicly funded research, vitally important, making the web work for science, and global IP, we move forward in ways that have been shown to produce much more innovation, that spur the generation of intellectual capital. there's also a downside. The downside is we say, let's stick with the old business models, Reed Elsevier's doing what they do, locking stuff up. I'm a scientist, why do I care about sharing my stuff with you? I'm not going to share it unless you incentivize me to do so. Our IP czars are told, we need more rights, we need to cut down on piracy, and that's the only problem. That is a problem. It's not the only problem. The happy story is one where we become a little more humble, a little more focused on data, and much more experimental, both on the private level and on the national level. Thanks very much.
Mm-hmm.